Hello everyone and welcome. Today is all about your hip flexors, okay? If you have hip flexor tightness, you feel like the front of your hips are always tight when you stand up for a long time or when you go for long walks or when you get up from a chair, or it feels like your hip flexibility just isn't moving like you want it to, today's for you, okay? So we're gonna talk about what is your hip flexor, how does it work? And then what information do you need to know if you feel like your mobility in this direction is restricted, okay? And I'm also gonna talk about how this can, for some people, be a cause of hip pain. All right, so let's talk about what is your hip flexor first. A lot of us have heard of it, but knowing what it is super helpful. So it's a muscle that starts in your low back. Okay, so it actually starts in the front part of your lumbar vertebrae, your lumbar spine, and then goes and attaches into the front of the hip. All right, so when it contracts, it pulls your knee up in space, right? So if the leg was here, it would pull the knee up in space into a direction called hip flexion, which is why it's called your hip flexor, okay? Another name for this is your psoas, all right? That's how the muscle shortens. The muscle lengthens when your hip goes into this direction, right? So when you're walking, going upstairs, running, getting up from a chair, coming up from a squat or a lunge, your hip is getting sent this direction into something called hip extension, which lengthens this muscle and causes or requires a contraction from the back of your hip or your glute muscles. Okay, so knowing that these two movements are opposite of each other, right? Ideally, our hip gets an equal amount of both types of movement. All right. And what's common for most of us, because we have to sit to work and do all the things that we have to do in life, we tend to get more of this movement than we get of this movement. Right? So a good question to ask if you are having a lot of hip flexor tightness or hip flexor tension is how much of this movement are you getting in your day-to-day life in your workouts, and how much of this movement are you getting in your day-to-day life in your workouts, okay? And of course, other things that are important to look at if someone's having hip pain, we need to look at their low back, their knees, your ankles, even your mid-back can play a role in this. So, if you're having hip pain, then that's, we want to look into all of these factors. This is a good place to look at your overall hip joint function and how you can get things moving better overall though, okay? So since most of us get more movement in this direction than we do this direction, often starting on restoring hip extension mobility and hip extension strength is a really good foundational place to start to improving your hip flexibility and balance. So in order to do that, two things need to happen. So if you think of this kind of like a sandwich, I call this the mobility sandwich, we need two things to happen on either, one thing on either side of the sandwich. The first is this muscle needs to open up in terms of flexibility, okay? So you'll see this week I'm gonna be sharing exercises that help you open up flexibility in this direction called hip extension. Now, if stretching alone helped it, that would make our lives all a lot easier, right? Oftentimes it doesn't. That's one of the reasons why is that we need to address the other side of this system. Both sides of the system need to be addressed. So it's restoring flexibility through the front of the hip, and it's also finding exercises that activate the muscles through the back of the hip. Now, this can be particularly challenging for people if their hip isn't accustomed to moving in this direction. And some signs that you may notice that the exercise might not be well suited for you is if you're not actually feeling it in your hip, if you're feeling it in your low back or your quad, or it feels like these muscles aren't engaging, it's often a sign that there's a better exercise for you. But ultimately that's what we want to find, is something that opens up the front of the hip and also challenges the glute muscle into hip extension. Now, ultimately hip flexibility and hip mobility, I think of it like a pyramid system. We have hip extension on the bottom, and then there are other types of hip mobility that are important too. And you may see things like this online about hip external rotation, hip internal rotation. All these types of mobility are really important. And this is a good foundational place to start if you are interested in improving your flexibility or some things that you might be feeling in your hip flexors. I hope that's helpful. Definitely drop any questions that you have about hip flexibility and your hip flexors below. And we will be diving into this more this week. Okay, take care.